Okay, then. So I think we'll get started there. So thanks ever so much for everyone for joining our webinar today on cybersecurity challenges during the COVID-19 crisis. I think it's fairly safe to say that this is one subject that seems to have really resonated with a lot of people. So I'm really hoping that you find this next hour or so beneficial. Um, we're really pleased to be running this event in conjunction with the Birmingham Law Society. So I just want to thank Natasha, Becky and the team for helping us get this event off the ground. And for those of you that might not be aware of Birmingham Law Society or what they do, then if you don't have an equivalent society in your region, it's worth noting that I think they're one of the largest regional society of its kind, representing around 5,000 legal professionals across Birmingham and the wider Midlands. And for those of you who don't know me or know who we are, so I'm Anish Chauhan. I'm Director of Equilibrium Security, and I'm joined today by Christian Toon, who's CISO at Pinsent Masons, and Joanna Barnwell from Trowers and Hamlins. So just a brief introduction to us. We are kind of referred to by our customers and our partners as that safe pair of hands, really. So we're, as security experts, we tend to implement, we design and we manage solutions for many blue chip, sort of public sector, right down to SMEs as well. So we're cybersecurity specialists is kind of effectively all we do. We're headquartered in Birmingham. We've also got a Scottish team who are based in Edinburgh as well. And like I said, cybersecurity is effectively all we do. Most of us have got, well, the slightly more older version, the older members of us have got 20 years experience in the industry. And what we do as a business, we tailor best of breed security solutions to our customers' needs. So that's just a brief intro into us. Now that we've done the introductions, the agenda for the remainder of the hour, we'll look at the COVID-19 impact on law firms. So, and I'll mention in a moment why we've specifically targeted law firms for this particular event. We'll also highlight the cyber risks that are associated with remote working, because that's really the focus here. We'll hear from Joe, from Joe Barnwell, and then straight after we'll hear from Christian as well. So we've got a sort of legal viewpoint of all of this as well. I'll talk about, after that, I'll talk about how to develop a bulletproof remote working strategy. So hopefully that'll be the really useful takeaway for you. And of course, we are starting to re-emerge from COVID and the lockdown. What that new normal looks like is obviously remains to be seen. But it's important that we overcome the security challenges both now and post lockdown, and once this gets lifted, whatever that new normal looks like. We have time for questions at the end. So what I will encourage you to do is during this next hour, if you think of a question, feel free to post it into the WebEx chat. And what we'll do, we'll collate them, and hopefully, if time allows, and we make sure we stick to our timeframes, we'll have around sort of 20 minutes at the end of the hour to follow those questions through. So hopefully we'll have time to get through all of them, and if we don't, we'll take them away. But please do feel free to post your questions as we go along. So I mentioned that we were specifically speaking about the legal industry for this. Now law firms are accustomed to office-based working. So we focus. We're based in Birmingham, ordinarily, and many law firms, many of which are our clients, they sort of pride themselves on having that real prominent and quite prestigious physical location. I think you'll all agree. And so the office-based working and the face-to-face meetings, and by the sheer nature of what you do, there's a need for sort of paper files and documents. So that's kind of been a real shift for legal firms. And many firms, you may have focused on sort of user connectivity, which is perfectly understandable, because at very short notice you'd have to get a number of users working from home. But perhaps you may have overlooked security versus user connectivity, perhaps. So when the lockdown was enforced, sorry, just bear with me, there's just a little bit of background noise. Just bear with me a second. So you mentioned. Okay. So what you may have found that you were doing was really perhaps focusing away from um, the office space, but making sure that things are being connected and people are working remotely from home. But you may have outdated security infrastructures which might have been tailored to office space working. They may not be fit to protect your remote workforce. And as a result, there may have been a kind of influx into targeted cyber attacks and phishing scams during the lockdown. So this is the impact that we've seen it as on the legal industry. So that kind of sudden shift that might have compromised the security of your information. So some of you might have read our blog, which has also been published in the latest Birmingham Law Society publication. But for those of you who haven't, it really highlights the challenges that were faced in this kind of somewhat forced transition. Now, digital transformation, it might be something that your business has been working towards, or you may have fully adopted it. But whether you have or not, pre-pandemic, law firms had the luxury of carefully planning that transformation strategy and perhaps working out the risks of remote working. But this sudden lockdown didn't really allow for this. And so many firms might have inadvertently introduced some security blind spots. So if we just look at the slide there, we've already touched on the quick deployment of remote working strategies, which means the strategy isn't being thoroughly tested. This, in turn, leads to critical vulnerabilities might be being introduced. And something we've seen sort of firsthand is this fast transition has led to some firms might be asking employees to use their own old or perhaps unsuitable laptops and mobile devices without necessary security measures being installed. And all of this leads to a real significant kind of lack of visibility, really. So, and this is an area I think I want to touch on in a little bit more depth. So users might be using Dropbox or Google Drives to share client information, which in most cases, that might be to make the client's life easier or your life easier or to get contracts signed in time. But that, again, that could be at the cost of client confidentiality. So the visibility of what users are doing is really important, because you could effectively be allowing the breach of client data without being able to report on it. Again, this has a knock-on effect of leading to security gaps and could mean that some of your regulations might be being breached. So I'm sure everybody knows of some cyber attacks that's happened against law firms, but we just wanted to touch on 2 or 3 and just give you some examples. So Grubman, Shire, Mazalis and Sachs, that was quite a recent one where hacking groups stole 750 gigs of sensitive data. This included emails, contracts, NDAs, phone numbers, and they demanded a ransom of 35 million to release that information. To not release that information, I should say. Another example was DLA Piper. This was quite a severe ransomware attack, affecting 3,500 lawyers across 40 different countries. The ransomware attack meant that all of their telephones and emails were completely inaccessible. And even 9 days after the attack, they still hadn't managed to recover from it. So yeah, you can really see the impact that had. And then another example is Anthony Gold Solicitors. 16,000 scam emails were sent using their business domain. So using terminology and language like action required, matter for attention, it's kind of coaxing email recipients to open that urgent attachment and ultimately reveal sensitive login information. So on that slightly sobering thought, I'm going to hand over to Joe at this point here to talk through Trowers and Hamlin's viewpoint from the cybersecurity challenge. So Joe, I'm going to hand over to you now.
Thanks, Anish. Can I just check that I can't see everybody necessarily here, but if there's a problem, then please let me know. Thanks, Anish, for the introduction and the invitation to speak. My name's Jo Barnwell. I'm a solicitor at Trowers and Hamlins, which, for those of you that don't know, is a full-service national and international law firm. Got offices in the UK in Birmingham, London, Exeter, and Manchester, and then in the Middle East and as far as Kuala Lumpur. I'm a solicitor in the Birmingham commercial litigation team. I have a broad general commercial litigation practice. A lot of my work focuses on civil fraud, and regulatory investigations, and I'm ever involved in litigation involving fraud, and increasingly seeing clients encountering instances of cyber-enabled fraud, particularly, should I say, in the lockdown period. As a team, we're seeing much more in the cyber and data breach space than ever before, and that's particularly noteworthy given that it's at a time when generally businesses are spending more than they've ever spent on cybersecurity and securing their systems and making changes to make their environments more secure. So it's interesting that the more you spend, arguably the more instances and the more challenges that present themselves. So I'm going to talk today a bit about some of the principles about what good looks like from a legal perspective when it comes to cybersecurity, and with that, what crisis management in the event of a cyber incident and the complexities and challenges of dealing with such incidents, particularly in the remote environment, looks like. Thanks for changing the slide, whoever's done that. I'm sure Christian will mention this and endorse this when he comes on to his piece shortly. But security in the cyber world is principally about knowing what you have in terms of data and where it is. Some of you will be aware of some of the bigger ICO and regulatory decisions of the last few years, where data breaches as a result of cyber incidents have hit the press, and there's been fines and findings against big companies, including household names such as BA, Ticketmaster, Marriott Hotels, Tesco Bank, to name a few. So as the slide said, it's very important that all our organisations, whatever you do, know what data they have and hold, because organisations collect large volumes of data knowingly and unknowingly, and what sort of data that is will depend primarily on the type of business that you are. You may collect personal and sensitive data. You might collect financial data. You've got to know what it is that you've got so that you can assess what relevant steps and safeguards you must take to protect it. An organisation has a positive obligation to do this. So I know this webinar is primarily focusing on law firms, and in that regard, law firms hold a lot of client data, which, depending on the type of work the law firm does and the type of clients they have, this may be financial data or sensitive data. If you're a private client lawyer, you might have very sensitive information relating to the financial matters of individuals, or if you're a probate lawyer, then you might hold information in wills and things like that that is really sensitive, and that's a special category in GDPR terms. Secondly, it's important to know where data is held. Often data stored on servers or in the cloud. There might be lots of hard copy documents. Again, Anish is the fact that law firms are renowned for having lots of hard copy documents and working in a very paper heavy way. Lots of law firms are trying to move away from that, but easier said than done. Although lockdown is probably helping lawyers move away from paper-based working and onto a more remote and paperless way. But it's important that organisations have their arms around where the data is. As I said, it's harder working from home because people will print stuff, people might review stuff in different places, save things in different places. It's arguably harder for an organisation in this landscape to have their arms around where data is held, but it's important that businesses take steps to identify where things are. And because data isn't necessarily within a network or an office environment, it's probably harder to map these days where data is and therefore how you go about securing it. And finally, who has access to the data? Where are the vulnerabilities? It's important that the organisations, to the extent they haven't already, do GDPR impact assessments and check that all is in order and identify gaps and weaknesses. Again, if impact assessments have been done, it might be that they need to be updated and to ensure things like privacy policies are up to date, and thinking about ways in which compliance can be monitored when staff are working from home. So this presents challenges. If someone can move on to the next slide, that'd be great. Thank you. So good security hygiene. Again, Christian will allude to this, I'm sure, but I'm going to talk about this from using a case study. This is really important to have good security processes in place. As I'm going to talk about a case study a job that I worked on a few months ago at the beginning of lockdown, where a client called and they'd been the victim of a ransomware attack. This was just before the lockdown, and they were a client in the logistics business, and they serviced supermarkets and other online retailers at a time when, if anyone remembers trying to get a delivery slot in March, they were at their busiest ever. They couldn't access their systems, and their biggest customers and big supermarkets, out of precaution, immediately shut off their account for fear that any kind of security breach would affect them also. So in the interest of precaution, they shut off their account, which had obviously huge operational and business interruption issues alongside that. Ultimately, the business had to explain itself to those key customers in order to get their accounts back online, and they had to act quickly and organise itself to respond to the incident on multiple fronts. They had to make a notification to the ICO because the server had been accessed and personal data was thought to have been breached. It transpired upon investigation that the client had recently acquired a company into its group which had old policies and outdated network infrastructure with weaknesses in it, which enabled the cyber attack to take place. There was a plan in place to work through updating the outdated systems, but it was only in its early stages, and not enough had been done to secure the weakness that was exploited. So all in all, it could have been worse, but data was accessed, a report to the regulator had to be made, a significant business interruption was encountered, which, as I said, against the landscape of having suppliers and supermarkets as customers was not ideal. And ultimately they had to review the data that was compromised, secure it, and notify anybody that they needed to notify about the breach of data. The last thing I want to say on that point is that they needed people on the ground to physically dismantle hardware in order to disable the ransomware. So again, this was just before the official lockdown, so it was possible for cybersecurity teams to go on site and to secure the network and do what they needed to do physically on site before they couldn't access it. But in a remote world, the response in that sense may look very different. So that's potentially going to be another challenge.
Yeah, I mean, dealing with this, Joe, when kind of we're not in a pandemic and just trying to kind of work normally, but like with all the pressures we've got on, I beg to think what the stress levels were in that organisation. Must have been tough.
Pretty high, and as it said on the previous slide, sorry, it is a business problem, not an IT problem, because the client called and it was panicking that IT needed to sort something out, and IT this and IT that, and it's fundamentally a board level problem, especially when you've got key customers saying we are not going to work with you until this is sorted, and you've got no idea the extent of the problem. It's not an IT problem, or IT obviously need to be front and center because they've got the technical knowledge, but it's more about business response and making sure everybody's lined up and everybody is engaging with the right people and making decisions together and in a way that is sensitive to regulatory investigation and those kind of things. So moving on, sorry, to the next slide. Crisis management. I'm going to talk a bit about this because this is where, excuse me, sorry, nearly knocked my coffee everywhere. I'm going to talk about this. This is where my team play a role in this space. Christian will go on to talk about the cybersecurity challenge in the remote world, but in terms of a data breach occurring for whatever reason, managing a crisis is arguably much harder in the remote world, because people aren't physically together, they can't physically see each other, they can't physically see the problem. However, the fundamentals are the same. One, react quickly and have experts lined up, and by experts I mean advisors, cybersecurity, consultants, PR potentially, lawyers, because it is really a joined up approach that is the best sort of way through any kind of crisis. Having lawyers engaged first is that they can ensure privilege over any investigation is maintained. This broadly means that communications with your lawyers as a business will be privileged. So the point is to not create and emails around an investigation which are potentially disclosable to a regulator or in proceedings down the line if that's what happens. So it's important that there is an element of control over what's created and what's said. So, but this is obviously more challenging working from home, because instead of having face-to-face conversations or meetings, people are more likely to send emails and generate more documents. The third thing is there has been a lot of criticism about how others that have encountered cyber incidents or data breach incidents have handled crisis management, and this has very much played into the level of fine that's been levied against them by regulators. So it's important to learn from those that have gone before and the mistakes that they've made, because that's very much how you deal with the problem. There's an expectation from the regulator's perspective that it's impossible to be 100% cyber secure. There's no obligation that firms have, organisations should be 100% secure. They know that is not attainable or realistic, but it is about showing how you've minimised the risks and how you have organised your data and taken steps to minimise the risk of a breach and how you deal with it, and that very much plays into the outcome. And lastly, I just want to say about managing the message. Go back to my case study, it was very much about not just reacting to the incident and shutting down the ransomware and getting the technical guys on site and managing the response to the regulator within a certain time frame. It's also about, you've got lots of stakeholders, whether it be employees, shareholders, customers, going crazy saying, what's going on, I can't access this, heard about this, what does it affect me, and managing that message is really important, because you don't want to end up saying something to one person that ends up you need to tell the regulator, or you're creating potential problems down the line for yourself. So managing that message and getting whatever external support to do that is really important too. Managing it in a controlled way is really key.
It's certainly how quickly information can fly out your organisation these days.
Yeah.
I really like the breach from, I don't know if you can like a breach or whether they're breaches that you favour over others, but the shipping giant Maersk, they got hit with ransomware, I think, back in 2017, and their response, which is very kind of clearly public and kind of documented now, is often cited as kind of what good looks like. So I'd certainly recommend anyone on the call to dig that out if they wanted to know kind of how to handle these sort of crises, because it's, yeah, you get it wrong and it can have just a devastating impact on everything.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's been a few organisations that have done it quite well, because as you said, Christian, the speed at which information can disseminate from an organisation, you just need somebody to post something on Twitter or on some sort of social media platform, and it just generates all kinds of it's then just, it's not contained at all, and then it's very difficult to crawl back to go back and try and control the message in any kind of way, because you're dealing with a completely different thing. So as an organisation, and again as a business, not just an IT team or whatever, but board level engagement on how to manage that and how to manage the different stakeholders is really, really important. So just to move on to the final bit, I'm going to talk about on the takeaway points. Working from home and working in a remote environment presents different challenges, but the underlying principles are the same. Prevention's better than cure. Know what you're dealing with, know where the data is, what you've got, do the due diligence on it. Arguably at home, I'd say there's more of an individual responsibility to to be alive to what data you have and where it is, and do what's necessary to keep that as secure as possible. As organisations, have plans, policies and procedures, think about how to best secure data and make sure infrastructure is secure. I know Christian's going to touch on this further, but train staff and make them accountable, because you really are reliant in an environment where you're not in an office and you're not on a secure network that business has got control over. You're really reliant on individuals to have appropriate measures in place. Thirdly, do crisis management well. Again, have everyone lined up, lawyers who are cyber, PR ready to assist, so you're in the best possible position to be advised and not miss anything response-wise, and capitalise on privilege. And fourthly, manage the message, be in control. When you're best done, this is best done when you're getting everything else right. And also, finally, be alive to the non-financial implications of something like this happening. It's worth the investment now in order that you don't have the scale of the problem isn't that you need to fork out later, because the management time in cooperating with an investigation, the reputation management is arguably far greater. It's much better if management and boards are engaged now to prepare and to put measures in place than they are to react later. And also to be mindful of the evolving legal landscape of group actions, where if there's been a data breach, individuals are bringing group actions against businesses for breach of their personal data, and again, that will be costly and time intensive, which ideally want to avoid. And that is all I wanted to say. And thank you for listening. And my contact details are on the next slide. So if there is any questions, happy to pick them up later on in the session. I think Anish said there's an opportunity, or if you want to pick up separately, my contact details are on the slide. Thank you for listening. I'll pass over to Christian.
Thanks, Jo. That was really, really insightful. Thank you. So whoever's on the slides, there we are. Thank you. So, we're in blue. Okay, so good morning, everybody. My name's Christian Toon. I'm the Chief Information Security Officer for Pinter Mason. We're a little law firm with offices in Birmingham, just on Cornwall Street. We have got offices around the globe. Main presence is here in the UK, but with offices as far away as China, South Africa, the Middle East, Australia, and a few other places in between. I'm told we've got an entity in the Falkland Islands, but still trying to find out if that's more than one lawyer and one penguin. But the search continues. I'm here today to talk to you about how we've kind of sort of transformed during this pandemic. Like Anish had mentioned, we pretty much 95% of our business was in a physical building, traditional office space, and not just the fee earning capability, but actually also our operational capability, our finance teams, HR, technology, etc. Some of which had never worked at home in their career and had spent time working through a kind of traditional office environment, and all of a sudden are expected to try and work remotely. And moving those people home, I'm going to sort of share a little bit more about that story. So on to our next slide. So the global pandemic has happened, right? And it's really forced a lot of businesses offline, and certainly prompted us to think differently. A lot of our traditional approach had been office-based, and like with some of the slides previously, had been around expecting to see you in the office because I need to see you to know that you're being productive. This is the way we've always worked, and why should it be any different? So for us, we've really taken this opportunity to think differently about how we operate. And I would certainly challenge and recommend everyone on this call to do the same if you're not already doing so, because the business world that was back in February 2020 will not be the same when we come out of this, whether that's end of July, August, later this year, or into next. We will be going back, I'm sure, into a physical world and kind of engaging, if anything, just for our own sanity and mental health, in the sort of a physical space. But actually, the way our businesses will operate will be massively different. Of course, we're not running out to look at and reevaluate our kind of office estate at the moment, but it's on the cards. As much as any kind of forward-thinking organisation will be looking to reevaluate their physical needs. So I would certainly kind of challenge you all to look at how you can change for the better. Next slide, please. So the puzzle in which Pinsent Masons found itself, pretty much at the beginning of March, like most, we were watching the news and keeping on with the announcements coming from the UK government, but also because of our business model, we were having to kind of be mindful of what was coming out from China, from Australia, and all the other offices we have across the globe. And it's fair to say that at best, pre-pandemic, we had about 250 people that would work from home or work remotely at any one time across the globe. Now, out of an organisation of about 3,500, you can really kind of show that we were very much a in-office kind of physical type of business, as many law firms have been. We had to move very swiftly to pretty much 3,500 people, concurrent users working at home. And that was hard. It was hard because our people, firstly, had not worked in those environments before. They were used to having their printer, their office stationery, their meeting rooms, etc. Just their people and colleagues around them, to arguably isolating them at home and then forcing them and expecting them to use technology that they're probably not used before. We saw a massive spike in help desk calls. A lot of people, they got home, they got on the internet, but couldn't get the things working, either because they'd never worked at home before, or actually the kit that they had meant that their access was quite different to how everyone else's had been. People had home networks, as many of you will, with children's devices, your own personal devices, Internet of Things, TVs, etc., all connected at home. And then actually you're plugging in a work device or accessing through a personal device and trying to navigate through all of that. People aren't necessarily blessed with their kind of IT insight of the kind of IT manager you have at work. So it was a really big thing for us to try and help our people navigate what working at home looks like. Because it's not normal. And whilst we're trying to work at home, we still need to kind of remind ourselves that we're trying to work at home during a health pandemic. So our policies on remote working or home working, yes, they're there, but they were there for when things were less crazy. So we've had to adapt those. The employee mental health has been a big priority for us because this isn't normal. So trying to get the technology to work in a secure and operational fashion that allows our fee earners to, well, earn the money and keep the lights on and kind of bring all the fees into the business. It's been really important for us to adapt to that. So we went into the pandemic and lockdown actually relaxing a lot of our security controls, because the controls we had in place were more designed for physical premises. So we were lovely, secure in our office block. But actually, when we moved home, that security actually impeded a lot of our teams. So we had to roll back a lot of that. And when I talk to people about that and say, well, we actually lowered some of the security controls in our business, that they kind of seem a little shocked, because you kind of think, well, surely everything should be secure all the time. But the reality is that's just not practicable. I will add, and probably as a caveat there, so my managing partner doesn't have kittens, is the fact that, yes, we did implement a number of other controls to allow us to monitor and detect what was going on. But actually, this was about getting our people operational. And no amount of security was ever going to get in the way of that. Going back to some of Joe's points, it's around the business. This is a business issue. It's not a tech thing. It's not a security thing. It's keeping your firm and your function running. We still had that kind of pressure to deliver to clients. The business was still here, and processes had traditionally relied on a physical presence or physical infrastructure. Although at the start of the lockdown, we did have a few attempts at people trying to wheel out those big MFPs that we had in the office because they wanted to print at home. Once we kind of settled with that, it was around understanding what the hardware requirements were or what the technology requirements were. moving a lot of what was quite traditional paper-based processes, not through want of trying to digitize, but as Joe mentioned, that we're still very paper heavy. How does that work in a remote, disparate, kind of connected world that we find ourselves in now? We've had to buy a lot of printers and ship them out and get them home and get them working. We've had to really kind of configure our processes to allow people to take advantage of digital services, but actually they've never used them before. So again, coming back to the people point, we've had to give them training. We've had to really kind of bring them on that journey. And ultimately, the work-life balance has been massively skewed because you're at home, and normally when you're at home, you're not at work, but you are at the moment. So the lines have been blurred, and that's been very difficult to manage personally as well as professionally. And then trying to put a security wrapper around that, we've really had to kind of think on our feet. We've seen a rise in personal devices being used for work. And that's not a bad thing if you've got the right controls in place. We'd not previously allowed that, but it was things myself and my team, we had to really respond quite quickly with. A lot of teams are a lot more vulnerable now, I guess, because of this isolation, that they don't have that kind of team they can bounce off, or the office environment. They can, hey, I've just received something looks quite funny. Can you come and have a look at this? With people using the internet a lot more, the risks associated with insecure web browsing, social media, etc., coupled with the distractions of being at home. Because they've got children, they've got animals, they've just got their home life sort of gently nudging them constantly whilst they're trying to work. And we've also seen across our demographic of people, different working environments. We've got people who have offices, who don't, people who work in spare bedrooms, people who work in dining rooms, people who are working on their bed because they're in a shared house. People are working in their garden shed because they're hiding from the children. So we've had to try and kind of get everybody to a level that the firm is happy with from a security perspective. It hasn't been the average kind of 9 till 5 run of the mill thing. And that's really kind of where I'm getting to with this, that our security program has had to enable us to adapt and change as the business has. Because if we have turned around and go, no, you can't do that, that's not secure, or we don't recommend that because the policy says no, then you're going to drive those people into further insecure behaviors. No, you can't use cloud storage, but I need cloud storage. I need to communicate large volumes of data between client X and Y and ourselves as a firm. And if you don't give your people a secure method or access to technology that will do that, they'll go and find out themselves. That they'll go and register with Dropbox, they'll go register with Google Drive or others. And I mean, they're just the main ones that you kind of know about. There are probably about 150 other sub-brands of cloud storage that you don't even know where the infrastructure sits, and you certainly don't want them using that. So you need to enable your teams, and if you don't, they'll go and find the insecure ways to do it. So challenge it. Sorry, go on, Joe.
Sorry, I was just going to say on that point that I think that's a really good example, because especially lawyers, I'm sure like a lot of businesses are working in a kind of very fast-paced environment. Everybody's facing challenges, so I'm personally finding a lot of the clients like, well, we need this right now, and everybody's banging their hands on the table, and you've got to find a solution, and that's a lot about what our job is finding solutions to problems. Yeah. So as you said, the more you don't have a secure, an easy access, secure way of doing something, you will be forced to find some way of just making it happen, which isn't necessarily secure, which might solve that short-term problem, but may create a bigger, longer-term problem.
Exactly that. And that's the thing, that kind of people are trying to adjust to a new normal for their working, and you need to give them the equipment, and whether that's technology, licenses, or even the bandwidth, excuse me, for those connections. It suddenly becomes a completely different focus. Go on to next slide, please. So this is where we see our kind of castle and moat strategy being kind of dead, I guess. So we talk about our castle and moat strategy. We talk about putting everything in the center, building the big walls, the defenses around everything, and keep everything safe in the middle. That's not a good way to carry on. And certainly at the moment, as we've moved into this pandemic, we've seen it gives a poor user experience. The costs can suddenly become very expensive. It reduces some of the visibility, believe it or not, because you've got legacy systems connected in here. And it's difficult to scale. And I know a lot of organizations have really struggled with that. But that's how we've built up our IT and technology organizations over the years, because that was seen to be the best way to do it. But unfortunately, now we can no longer continue that way. So I'd certainly look to advocate changing from that, building everything so you've got visibility in one place. You need to kind of open your boundaries and start looking more now to cloud-first architecture. And that is what we've done at Pinsent. So on to the next slide. Thank you. So when we talk about cloud-first architecture, this isn't just about throwing everything else onto somebody else's computer, because that's what we talk about being cloud, whether it be the big Google's, AWS, Microsoft, technology businesses that allow you to push your perimeter outside your organization. It gives you massive capability to scale and control things that you've never done before, and certainly operating in an isolated, disparate environment as we are now. Those that have enabled cloud first and using technologies like that, they've really seen a big difference, that this sort of transition has been quite seamless. But it's not without risk. So you can't just open up an account and start pushing data in there. There are lots of considerations you need to have. The technology is available for you to use, either as a platform as a service or software as a service or even infrastructure, but it's your responsibility to ensure that it's configured, controlled, protected to your level of expectation. The providers won't do that. They'll give you a baseline default, but actually you need to add in multi-factor authentication. You need to add in data segmentation, or from a privacy point of view, making sure where you can store that data, because a lot of these clouds, they operate on such a global footprint. You might, without thinking about it, upload from here, from the UK, and find out your data is being stored in the US. Nobody wants that without the right controls. You've also got a lot of encryption points to consider. Sorry, give me a second. I'll finish this slide and then we'll get on. You've got to then look at, I guess, how the attacks are being leveraged, and certainly cloud is where targets are being found. Office 365, remote working, the access control around those architectures is absolutely paramount, because once the attacker can get into those environments, they can just then sprawl across and they'll have access to all sorts. And like we saw from the previous examples of breaches, it's not a good place to be. And the challenge, certainly from a law firm perspective, is going back to that castle and moat view, is that is a lot of history, a lot of legacy technology that exists within your organization. And a lot of the time, it can just be too hard to try and unpick and to try and move. You probably have systems that won't even move into the cloud because they've just been designed for on-premise operation. That's where kind of that great kind of information security professional Socrates was I'm constantly quoting him around: focus your energy on building the new and not on fighting the old. That's really how you need to approach with this. So next slide, please.
Sorry, before you move on, Christian, I would just say about the getting rid of the old thing, is be aware if you've got old systems and servers, because as I said, the things that I've seen is it's often where there's old servers, just shut them down, just get the stuff off it and shut them down, because they'll come back to bite inevitably, because the newer stuff will be secure, no problem, hackers won't be able to get in. But where there is an old server and a weakness there, you can bet your bottom dollar that's what they'll find. Yeah. And you don't want that to be the thing that gets you.
No, I totally agree. But that is so easier to say. That's hard.
Oh, God, it's so easy said than done.
The amount of reliance on that one old system, and you just kind of think it's just absolutely crazy, because there's so many interdependencies. It's hard.
If you're
good security. Yeah.
If you're looking at remodeling or rebuilding or your architecture, then it's something you should definitely be considering.
Yeah, definitely, without a doubt. Because it's, good security isn't actually doing all the fancy stuff and AI and machine learning, artificial intelligence. It's just getting the basics right. Well, they're not basics, because it makes assumption they're easy. The fundamentals of security, that's where it comes. So here, the kind of making security work better for people, it's been a constant theme around, actually, look, we need to enable the business, and that's what good security needs to do. People need to understand and have it seamlessly integrated into what they do. Otherwise, they won't use it. They'll work around it. We've seen examples around bandwidth challenges in South Africa or in China, that because the service or speed of service isn't where it needs to be for that end user experience, they've gone around and find something else that works for them. And that's a worse place to be. So you need to really get that there. And not only around the solutions being working for them, but actually you need to support them in doing their day job. So kind of for me, the security threats should not be your first priority. Your people should be, your security team should be. If you take care of those security team, take care of your people, they'll take care of the security threat. So one of Joe's points earlier around awareness and training, make sure your people know what they're dealing with, keep them up to date with the latest threats, give them the advice and guidance they need, encourage reporting. Don't lambast them for clicking on phishing tests and telling them how kind of stupid they are for falling for it, because people do. You need to give them their support. And the last couple of minutes, I'll just move on to the kind of closing slide around what's next. So we're in this pandemic still. We are where we are. We've gone through a lot of the hard stuff. So what are we going to deal with? We've still got that pressure to deliver with clients and being mindful of kind of what our processes look like now. We've had to make some very quick changes, and we're now looking back at those changes to ensure that we've got the right level of security around those. We're obviously a lot more conscious of the malicious calls and sort of, I guess, the isolation people find themselves in and the distractions of home, and making sure we're giving them the right awareness and the right support to help them through that. We're obviously making sure we're scanning for the available information online, what we call operational or open source intelligence, stuff that's available on both the kind of the internet and the subnet or darknet, social media, to sort of see where the attacks may be coming from or data may be leaking from the organization. We're giving support and focus to those home configurations and making sure that we're not connecting ourselves to insecure home networks. And really sort of focusing on that end user experience. We're moving our perimeter to the endpoint, as it's kind of often called, so the computer, the laptop, etc. And that's where our focus is and will continue to be. So thank you for allowing me the time to talk. I'm always kind of like these environments because you can't know if anyone's going to fall asleep whilst you're talking, and nobody can throw anything at you. So I'm maintaining 100% success record. Contact details are there on that last slide. So if you do want to further the conversation, please get in touch. I'll be more than happy to share some of the details about what we've done and how we can possibly help. Thanks, Ed.
That's really good. Thanks a lot for that, Christian. It was really, really useful, and Joe. And I think the kind of takeaways really are, protecting vulnerable systems, and people are moving away from the physical building. The business world isn't going to be the same. Using personal devices, and I think probably what a lot of people might be thinking, okay, great, absolutely, but how? How do we do all these things? I don't think anybody on the call is going to disagree with those things need to be done. And so the next sort of pushing on a little bit, next 10 minutes or so, I'll try and cover all of that off as best as I can. And we have had some questions come through, but what I will do is I'll if we don't get around to them all, I'll try to come back to you individually. So what can businesses be doing to ensure there's a kind of strong degree of flexibility? Because that is really important, but also couple that with making sure users operate in that secure manner. Because I know many of you are going to enjoy the flexibility of working from home. The adjusted hours might mean you might stop working around 5 to spend a bit of quality time with the family. I know for me, that's a welcome exchange from trying to make a dash for the 6:30 train and finding it's delayed. And I certainly welcome it. And for us at Equilibrium, many of our customers as well we speak to, they've got no plans at all to move away from it because it's working. So like I say, we need to kind of ensure it's going to continue, but make sure those security practices become the norm. So the way in which we do this is we have layers of security defenses. So you have a strategy where you have multiple different components. One solution isn't going to, you can't buy a product necessarily off the shelf that will just fix all these problems on its own. You've also got to have sort of user and device visibility, which Joe and Christian have separately touched on, because the use of cloud services, super important. It's really flexible. I don't think anyone's going to argue with that, but there is a natural byproduct that comes out of that. And that byproduct is that loss of user visibility and device visibility. And really, we need to kind of underpin all of that with some kind of, advanced threat intelligence, which I'll explain a bit more detail. So the way in which I've broken the next few slides down is to 4 key areas. The first one being endpoint security. So as Christian said, there's always this emphasis of protecting unauthorized access coming into the organization through firewalls at the perimeter, but that perimeter has been diminishing for some time, and actually the speed of disappearance has been accelerated with this COVID lockdown and everyone working from home. So where the focus needs to be is what's happening on that endpoint. Is it a laptop? Is it a mobile device? Is it a tablet? What's going on there? Now, antivirus products do go some way into protecting these, but they're normally quite reactive and not really able to protect an endpoint from the continual development and advancing and adapting of most current malware. So best way of thinking about this is if you think about a virus or a piece of malware, it's just a piece of code that someone's written and it acts in a certain way. Now, most antivirus engines, the way in which they detect that is a signature's got to match. So if it matches, it detects and it alerts you, go, this is a virus. But the tiniest tweak to that, and I mean minuscule tweak, could mean it will go undetected. And this is how kind of malware evolves and ransomware evolves and kind of tries to become stealth-like. So what needs to occur instead of this kind of signature base is the normal everyday behavior of the endpoint needs to be learned. Okay, so what's normal for this endpoint? What does it normally do over a month, over a week, over a day? And actually then alert if something malicious happens beyond that. And only by using techniques like machine learning and big data analytics and harnessing global threat intelligence can an endpoint detection technique really be effective. So if we look at the slide, so if we start in the top left corner, any endpoint security strategy needs to be able to protect it proactively, detect and block both known and unknown cyber threats. You need to be able to run advanced investigations across all corporate endpoints. So whether that's corporate issued or personal, that's all coming into the same thing, because if it's accessing company resources, then it needs to be managed and monitored and be able to detect that stealth-like malware, as I said. Need to be able to rapidly contain attacks, because if something does happen, you need to identify it and stop it from propagating anywhere else, and also be able to remediate that malware across those devices. And then finally, you kind of need to prioritize threat alerts, because what happens is most security systems, you tend to get kind of alert overload. There's just it's really difficult to be able to identify what's a risky event and what's a benign one. So anything needs to be able to make that differentiation between the two. And as the slide shows, it's a continual thing. It's not something you can do as a point in time activity. And so the next element, so after we look at the endpoint, we then look at our remote access security in general. So there was a time when all VPNs, the way in which we secured remote access was using the use of VPN, which is fine if everything is in the office or everything is in the data center. So users needed to VPN in to be filtered. But what about when those users don't need to access company resources, or they're just browsing the web, or the way things are shifting now, what about if those resources aren't actually in the company environment, they're in Office 365, they're in Google Docs or some other kind of web-based services? How are you going to protect the endpoint devices then? You've got to have the ability to secure the devices to those sites and ensure the credentials don't get into the wrong hands. So if we look at the slide, 4 kind of key areas really. So you need to be able to uniquely identify and securely authenticate the users. You've got to make sure the site they're visiting, be it Office 365 or being it some kind of HR or finance system, make sure it's not being spoofed, make sure it's not inadvertently visiting something else. You also need to have the ability to granularly deactivate and activate users. So if users are leaving or they're going on furlough leave, how are you going to be able to, with a click of a button, disconnect them or reconnect them if you need to? And actually some firms are obviously looking at their staff overhead, perhaps descaling. How are you going to disconnect that access really quickly? And the last one is really important. So Joe mentioned it, I think, about sort of vulnerable systems and most breaches happening as a result of this. That you need to create this kind of barrier to entry to make sure that devices that they're using, whether it's corporate issued, whether it's personal, meet a specific security policy. What I mean by that is if the browsers are out of date, if it's an iPhone and the iOS version's out of date, that means there's a known vulnerability that's in there. So if you create that barrier to entry, you say, okay, well, I'm not going to let you, even if I know you're a legitimate user, I'm not going to let you connect in, access our services, until you meet this security level, which is really, really powerful. So phishing, we've all talked about phishing. One of the biggest problems that all companies face is the social aspect of phishing. It's not the actual, the content. It's how the malicious threat actors use social engineering attacks to coerce you to click the link, using time pressures, urgency. We've seen first-hand examples where directors, in a seemingly abrupt tone, are asking for a link to be clicked or a document to be opened. And most staff, because of who it's come from or who it's purported to come from, are kind of more concerned about not complying with the request instead of, querying the validity of the email. Similarly, we have whaling, which is kind of the same thing, but albeit in reverse. So specifically targeting a senior director, claiming to maybe come from IT, saying, okay, your password needs to be reset immediately, because if you don't do it, you're going to lose access to everything you need access to. And so, you're coercing the individual to click that link, and by doing so, they'll have provided their login credentials. So it could just be a momentary lack of vigilance that can cause an entire company to be impacted, like the examples we saw. And the legal industry is definitely a target for these attacks. Property completion dates, there's all these deadlines that these threat actors can use and leverage to get them to coerce the user to clicking the link. So training an organization is really important. I think Christian mentioned that. But testing them using phishing campaigns is a great way of doing this. But also, you might already carry out penetration tests to test vulnerable systems, but what about testing people? How vulnerable are they against such techniques? So it's important that they know how to spot phishing and social engineering attempts. It's important they know the motives and reasons, because the more likely a user understands the motives, they're more likely to be able to spot malicious attempts. And of course, you need the security mechanisms to underpin all of this, so that momentary lack of judgment doesn't cause a major outage. And visibility, so we've mentioned this quite a few times, and it is really important, but quite often there's a focus on kind of an individual security product. What is the antivirus blocking? What is the firewall blocking? What's it doing? But you really need to have that joined up view across everything, so that if a threat is spotted, you know where it's gone, where did it go, what systems did it touch, and what can we do to kind of stop it from happening again. And I mentioned global threat intelligence a few times. So what that is if a new piece of malware is detected, on the other side of the globe, then taking global threat feeds from organizations who, taking that in and you understanding what it is, it kind of identify it and block it from further activity. So that's something that most security tools and systems will be able to do, and it's really important that that's leveraged in the current climate. And all of this is going to really allow you to continue your business in a kind of non-reactive way and keep your business protected. So I'm mindful of time, so I'm going to rattle on a little bit. But basically, we are coming out of this COVID-19 situation. We are going to, lockdown is going to lift. But what does the new normal look like? There's 5 real key areas that I kind of, that kind of need to be taken away. So the first one, proactively identifying cyber threats is really important across the device, regardless of what it is. We talked about, I don't know if we use this term actually, but shadow ICs, that this term refers to the unauthorized applications, those users using Dropbox when they shouldn't really be able to. So how do you make that distinction? Okay, you might say Dropbox is fine or OneDrive is fine, but I don't want to use these apps. And there's new web apps coming out all the time. So it's having that ability to be able to control those and endorse the ones that are authorized. We need to ensure security even when VPNs aren't being used, because remember, VPNs are just a very simple single use case, and 9 times out of 10 in the current climate, we really don't see VPNs being users aren't forced to use them, because the resources they're accessing aren't in the company environment, they're in the cloud. So ensuring the security on the endpoint device is really important. We need to educate users to spot the sophisticated phishing attempts, and they are sophisticated. There was a time when the only spam email you used to get was from a Saudi prince asking you to transfer £100,000. But those emails are very, very few and far between now. They're sophisticated. They look very, very well crafted. And overall, you need to have the ability to detect anything anomalous. But what is normal? Okay, so if something deviates from normal, then we need to be able to spot that and prevent that. Just the last kind of sort of roundup from me is for everybody that signed up, we did offer a free 4-hour security review. So what we were able to do there is conduct a basic gap analysis across your systems, across policies, and across security controls. And actually, 9 times out of 10, what we find is that you already have the process, you already have the policy, you might even already have the security tools, but it's extending them, it's making sure those gaps are plugged. So please do take us up on that, because we are trying to help clients in this difficult situation, and ultimately this is a fight against criminal threat actors. So we are please do follow the instructions at the bottom. So if you email Zoe, she'll follow that through and arrange a slot for you. If you head the email legal webinar security review, we can certainly look at that for you as well, and just state your company name and your name and position, and we can book that slot for you, no problem at all. So that's the end of that. I am mindful that we have run over a little bit, but we do have time for some questions. So if attendees are able to stick around for a little bit longer, I'll try and run through some of these now. Let me just bring some of these up. Okay, I'm just going to try and pick some at random because they are some of them do cover others. So how do you ensure remote workers are sticking to the rules that you've put in place? That's a really good question, because it's quite difficult to, it's a combination between policy and technical controls. So one aspect is policy, is the answer to that. So making sure that they sign up to maybe an IT use policy, but the question, I guess, is how you ensure they're sticking to it, and just underpinning that with some kind of security control. So you might say, for example, okay, you're not allowed to go to and use Dropbox. How do you ensure that? There's got to be a technical controller to underpin it, because 9 times out of 10, like we said, users are trying to do what's right for the customer, right? Trying to do what's right for the firm, but actually they might, without realizing it, do that. So education, technical control, and policy, I'd say, were the three aspects to that. We've got other questions around sort of shadow IT, which I think that kind of answers that. How can you prevent email spoofing attacks and protect your business domain? Okay, that's a great one, because when we talk about visibility, what a lot of organizations overlook is who is sending emails on behalf of your domain. Now, from a marketing point of view, you might use a marketing platform, you might use MailChimp or something along those lines, but actually there's a firm in let's just say, for example, China that's using that information, or Afghanistan, for argument's sake. These might be places. These might raise alarm to you. It's like, hold on, why is there an IP address in these countries sending emails from my domain? So that's one way. So putting in controls where you can monitor what emails are being sent is a great way of doing that. So hopefully that answers that question. Do we need to think about providing small firewalls to staff? Kind of yes and no. So not in the conventional sense. So when we talked about how there's no longer that perimeter, if you had 2,000 staff, or even just a couple of hundred staff, providing firewalls to all of them at home is probably not really necessary. What we do is we look at something to control the endpoint. So the underlying kind of question here is visibility and controlling the endpoint. So if we can look at what security controls you have in place, we might be able to say, okay, we need to extend this to the endpoint now. We need to make sure we're controlling it in a manner that controls what that endpoint is doing. Learning what's normal, where is it going, and what should it be doing under normal circumstances. So hopefully that answers that question. I'll just pick a couple more. Because I'm mindful, again, we've sort of run over a little bit. So with the staff that we have furloughed, how do we monitor their accounts and emails to make sure they haven't been compromised? That's a good one, actually. So that question is it's sort of 2 or 3-fold, really. So the first one is you need to have the ability to flick that switch that I mentioned to say turn them off if they have been furloughed, because from a I guess, a HMRC point of view and maybe a legal point of view, if they are on furlough leave, they shouldn't really be doing any work anyway. The second thing is how to monitor them. It kind of ties back to the domain, really. So if you've disconnected them, they shouldn't be able to log in at all. So with Office 365 and with Google and with quite a lot of them, there's that ability to flick that switch, and so monitoring them becomes a little bit less important. However, if for whatever reason they do need access to it still, first they may be training, you can monitor a little bit the same way in the domain. You can keep an eye on that and see where login attempts are, and then that all underpins back into visibility as well. I think we've probably got time for one more, so let me have a quick look. So I haven't done these in order, so I hope I'm not repeating myself. When using third-party software such as CRMs and legal software, how do you confirm they're secure? Okay, so there's two ways of doing this, and actually, from the previous point, there's another point worth making here. So we need to secure access to them, and the way in which we do that is using some kind of two-factor authentication. So having that in place will allow you to disconnect their access quite quickly, but also making sure that their information isn't compromised. And then the flip side of that is to make sure you're accessing that securely is by looking at certificates and making sure that the site that you're visiting is indeed secure and does claim what it needs to be. So training users is one aspect to doing that, to making sure they're visiting and they're getting the right certificate. They're not getting certificate warnings. Training them to what to look out for will certainly help with that. So hopefully that answers that question. And I think that's probably covered most of them. I'll try to, I've picked up the ones where I don't know who it's come from because it's come from perhaps a calling user, but I will, I'll try to respond to anything that I haven't responded to sort of directly and personally. So mindful that we've run 10 minutes over, and despite practicing time slots and things like that, this does happen. So apologies if I've kept anybody. And for anyone that does want to share this, I think if I'm right in saying, guys from the Birmingham Society, this video will be made available. So if you want to share it with colleagues, then please feel free. But I thank you very much for your time. I know it is, everyone is more busy, although we have more time in our diary at the moment because we're not traveling. The general consensus is that's being filled very rapidly. So thanks ever so much for your attention. I hope it was really useful to everyone. I've got a couple more questions that have come through about sort of Zoe's email. So I'll add that directly, but it's zoe@equilibrium-security.co.uk. So what you can see on the screen for my email address is the same thing, but with Zoe as a first name. So thanks again to Joe, thanks again to Birmingham Law Society, and thanks Christian. Thanks a lot, everybody else.
Yep, thanks for having us.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, bye.
Bye.